Well, welcome to Leaders on the Frontier. My name is David Leis. I'm your proud host. And today is February 22nd, 2024, the year of our Lord. And we're going to be talking about a very important topic today that's related to prosperity in our federation, and including arguably federal policies undermining the prosperity and the future of not just Alberta, but frankly, other provinces as well. So we are delighted that you could join us as an audience on both X and also on YouTube. We're really appreciative of your feedback, and we're looking forward to it today. So today we're going to have a special guest, and that is, of course, the research fellow at the Frontier Center for Public Policy, Lee Harding. Welcome, Lee.
Hello, David.
Well, Lee, it's great that you could join us because you've come up with quite an interesting report about the topic that we're going to talk about, and that is, is federal policy undermining Alberta and Albertans? So it's interesting. It's titled 12 Years of Labor in Alberta. And you go through quite an analysis, and it's interesting. And we'll kind of walk through the report step by step. But and there we've got it up on the screen, and you can see that on our website at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. So be sure to look at it. But if you had to think of the headline, what does this report really mean? It's really quite an interesting read. But Lee, what's really the headline here?
Well, what I did was I looked over the last 12 years to see what labor statistics could show about the three political eras of the last 12 years. So starting with the Alison Redford Progressive Conservative government, and then also the stint that was under Jim Prentice, and then we shifted to an NDP term. And then after that, since then, we've had the UCP government under Jason Kenney and now Danielle Smith. And so what I was really wanting to know is the private sector moving faster than the public sector? That was the initial part of it. That didn't seem to be as big an issue as it is in some other provinces and places. But what I found in other regards was some interesting things, and also fresh evidence that under the Trudeau Liberal government in Ottawa, Alberta has been falling behind, whereas previously it was outpacing the rest of the country. And I think that's probably the most significant finding.
Okay, so you've really peeled the perennial onion. You've got at the facts, the evidence, the employment stats, and you've cut through all that noise and basically figured out that, wow, governance matters, who's in power matters, and those policies have a big impact on Canadians and where you live. Is that it?
Absolutely. Absolutely, David. That's precisely it.
Okay, so when we look at this, we've got a lot of different eras. Is there a way to kind of summarize at a top level what really are some of the highlights here? Like, for example, I mean, I think people would be kind of shocked or surprised. Like, Alberta's kind of a magnet for people moving to Alberta for future prosperity. I think well over 100,000 people are moving to Alberta annually. But you said something, Alberta's underperforming. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look over the last 12 years in the rest of the country, the growth in the working age population is matched by the growth of employment. So that makes sense. I mean, we're talking people who are aged 15 to 64 as the same percentage growth nationally. You see the same in both. But in Alberta, it hasn't kept pace. And it's not entirely clear to me why that is. One of the things that I found is that in the Prentice era, we saw a real drop in oil prices. And that obviously, it's such a cyclical industry that just wipes out a lot of the research and development in oil and the drilling. And there was a 50% increase in the unemployed males at that time. So from, if you look at the month of October 2011 to seasonally adjusted to the month of May of 2015, when Rachel Notley took the reins, there is 50% higher male unemployment than there was before. And what I found is that never actually came back. Now, because the population has grown over those years, The fact that there's the same number of male unemployed is probably represents modest growth in an ironic way, but or progress, you might say. But really, though, in some ways, those jobs never came back. And so what we see over and over again is that Alberta has relied on the energy sector, and one of the ironies that I found is that in the Trudeau era, wages have grown 3 times as fast in the rest of Canada as they did in Alberta, and also that in wages overall, and the wages in the mining and energy and forestry sector combined, that they're growing 3 times as fast. So now that's total wages. That's not like they're making $25 here and they're making 75 later. No, this is the total. This is the amount of all the wages that are paid, because there's a statistic that we keep nationally as to the total wages and salaries in any given sector, both in a province and nationally. And so if you look at the growth rates, if you look at the comparison of the months of when these regimes started and ended, you see quite a contrast. See, in the PC era, when federally we had a conservative majority government, Alberta was actually outpacing it. It was the growth in total wages was 25% in Alberta and was 15% in the rest of the country. And it's just the opposite now. Canada is outpacing Alberta, and I don't think it's really all of this is Alberta's fault. It was certainly much worse under the Notley government. We saw some of the stats actually contract, where there was less money. Even with population growth, there was a drop in wages of more than 5% of the total wages that were paid out. So you have a lot more people coming in. You don't have many more jobs, and you actually have less total wages paid out. So that's very, very poor performance.
So it's kind of a surprise. So what would explain this when you mentioned about federal policies negatively impacting Alberta's economy? Can you give an example that would help us understand what's going on here?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the energy sector. I mean, we're all familiar with the carbon tax and how that's discouraging the use of fossil fuels, which we have in abundance, really. And our total global emissions is only 1.6% of the total. So it's really not going to make much of a difference in global temperatures. And also, if the world warmed, Canada would be the winner. I think we'd all like it to be a little bit warmer. And the only place we find these increased storms as a clear connection to carbon emissions is in their computer models. So that's even our recent forest fire spell. There was a single arsonist that set up a lot of them, and yet this is being used as a narrative for climate change. But I've lost the trail a little bit. Could you repeat the question,
Well, I mean,
David?
I guess what we're trying to get at is how is the federal government in terms of policies? And I can list example after example, but what are the examples that are impacting the province of Alberta?
Well, all this bent towards net zero means a net zero for the economy. That's what it really means. It means zero
Okay.
economic growth, zero new jobs. You can only recycle the public tax dollars so much to make these renewable windmills and solar panels and what have you. If there was a real market for it, the private sector would have been doing it already if it was actually practical. So
Right.
we've seen policies where regulations have made it very difficult for pipelines to be built. Even some of the resource projects themselves, they've just said, we just don't think we can do anything in the current environment. They walked away from it. The northern coast of BC, that has been declared off limits for exports. So that was the only one that the government explicitly, the Northern Gateway pipeline, that was not going to go. But the other ones, it's just basically been, we have an environment that is so adverse that you can't get anything done. And so the government can say, well, we're not the ones standing in the way, but really they are. And if we'd have had all the pipelines built, including Energy East, I mean, it would have been $25 billion of economic value. The jobs, I mean, the squandered opportunity is one of the worst things that this government is responsible for.
Okay. So part of your report certainly shows the kind of statistical measures that are undermining Alberta's employment performance. So that has a big impact on people's income and their standard of living, their quality of life. But in many ways, this is not surprising given the kind of federal policies that you just cited, where they're really strategically not enabling the oil and gas sector to be able to thrive, like getting product to tidewater, to oceans for export. And we're in a world, as you say, that desperately needs energy. So, in many ways, that's not a surprise. But would there be lots of other examples where the federal government is really intruding, arguably, in provincial jurisdiction? When you look at, for example, the whole quote clean electricity regulations that the federal government has introduced. I mean, we've heard a lot about that this last week, where I think it was in January that the Alberta electricity grid was having difficulty meeting demands. And so, if you'd introduce those quote clean electricity regulations, would that not also be another example, Lee, where that is just going to be more of the same type of policies that undermine that province?
Oh, absolutely. They're doubling down. There's no question that they're continuing on a reckless path of destruction in the name of they're destroying us in the name of saving the earth, and
Hmm.
it is a very serious problem. There were now with the carbon tax itself, the Supreme Court sided with the federal government to say they could do it. They said it's a carbon levy; it's not really a tax, so we won't call it a
Hmm.
tax in the environment. Of course, there's wide speculation that if this was about Quebec industry, that it would have been a different kind of answer from the Supreme Court of Canada. But be that as it may, yeah, it is an intrusion. There were some judges who did say, yes, this is an intrusion. This is not constitutional for you to be putting this carbon tax on because it's a tax on resources. Resources are provincial, and you don't have the right to do that. But they are doing it.
Hmm.
And they found enough judges to agree with them that they're going to keep doing it and doing it more. And every April 1st, we see another $15 a ton. Now,
Hmm.
on carbon. And of course, they will have some rebates. And it's been demonstrated in various ways that these rebates aren't exact rebates. Even as Brad Wall said when he was still premier, if you're going to just rebate it back, why do it in the first place? Well, because it serves as a disincentive to use the, to have carbon consumption. But the problem is in a country like ours, we need it for everything. We have a lot of resources, and to get at those resources and get them to the world to make our world and the rest of the world a better place, we need to
Hmm.
have roads. We need to have gas and diesel and be able to move around. And now the government said, well, we're not going to fund any roads anymore either. And
Now, sorry, which
that's
government has
the
stated
federal
that,
government. The
Lee?
federal
The federal
government and
government.
Guilbeault said the environment minister that they're just not going to fund them. So,
Okay.
well, that's very dangerous to say that. Now, where's the money going to come from? Are we going to have toll roads everywhere? Maybe that's the way we need to
Hmm.
go. If the government's not going to fund it, let's have users fund it. We have this wonderful resource in the ground, and it looks like we're just going to keep it there, and everyone else who needs it,
Hmm.
they're not going to have it either. And now Charlie Angus of the NDP has brought in a bill basically to say that you cannot say anything positive about the fossil fuel industry, or that's misinformation. If you say that one
Okay.
form is less damaging than another and this kind of thing, you can't even say that. So I don't think that bill's going to
Hmm.
pass because it's so ridiculous. But it does indicate the kind of environment that we're in, that someone would even think of that.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so this is the MP Charlie Angus, who's introducing a private member's bill to censor and under penalty, if memory serves me correctly. I've not read the specific bill, but I understand its basic summary is to basically censor and by penalty ban speech that would talk positively about oil and gas. No, it's really quite absurd. So I'm speaking with research fellow with the Frontier Center for Public Policy, Lee Harding, and Lee has tabled a report. It just came out earlier this week called 12 Years of Labor in Alberta, A Tale of Three Political Eras. So we'd welcome your questions and comments. What do you think? I don't know if you've had a chance to review the report, but basically the headline is that it reveals a lot of Alberta's economic challenges over these different political eras, and including the Trudeau Liberal government era of policy. And this is not meant to be a partisan discussion, but it does seem to underline that who is in political power and the political policies that they pursue do matter in terms of our prosperity. Is that right, Lee?
Yeah, that's what it's come to. I mean, I let the stats speak for themselves. I didn't know what I would find. I mean, there are some things that Albertans knew intuitively, that the Notley years were difficult for the energy industry, difficult for economic growth, and that it has had some resurgence under a more business-friendly UCP governments.
Mhm.
But to see it statistically is just another matter entirely. And again, there were a few surprises. Um, when
So
you look at the,
what was this a key surprise that you noticed as you were working on this report?
well, just that Canada was getting ahead so much faster than Alberta was. And Alberta is the
Hmm.
economic powerhouse of Canada proportionally.
Mhm.
And to not have that is, I mean, you don't want to kneecap the thing that's most important to you. You really don't want to be stunting
Mhm.
what is best. It's sort of like benching Connor McDavid. It doesn't really make sense to do that if you actually want to win.
Yeah.
And some of these other things, like the numbers of
But hold
employed
on for a
people
sec.
falling behind.
I don't want to bury that headline, Lee, because I think what you're saying is that energy, affordable, reliable, um, energy has been kind of an ace card for Canada's prosperity, let alone much of the world, because that affects everything. Not only in terms of heating our home, but in terms of the competitiveness of our manufacturing sectors, service economies, everything. So if you're kind of the federal government's intent, to be clear, is to shut down Canada's oil and gas sector.
Well, yes, and
So this
they're
is
not.
kneecapping, pardon me?
Yeah, well, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, yeah, that's exactly what they've said they're doing. They want to transition us off of fossil fuels, net zero, net
Hmm.
zero. So,
Hmm.
yeah, this is one of the reasons that the carbon tax rebates don't work, because when you have a carbon tax on your gasoline, first of all, you need energy to produce anything, to heat anything, to do anything, to go anywhere. So if you handicap that, if you tax that and discourage that through taxation, what will end up happening is you will have less GDP, period. You will have
Hmm.
less economic development. And even if you do accept the climate change narratives, it would be better to face them in a position of economic strength than it would be from a position of weakness. If we need to have better buildings and this and that, let's have them. If we have, the more wealth we do, the more we can actually prepare.
Hmm.
The approach we're taking is almost like trying to change the weather outside instead of putting a coat on. I mean, let's be in a position
Hmm.
to do something for ourselves. But yes, and with the carbon tax, what you see is, okay, we have a carbon tax in the gasoline and the diesel, and it goes up and up and up. Well, what happens? Well, that's going to go onto your food when it goes to the
Hmm.
grocery store, as we take it
Yeah.
from our fields and distribute it out to our cities. So does that get rebated back? No. And the
Hmm.
government is getting more revenues than ever, because all of this really drives it up. So you can rebate the carbon tax, but it doesn't stop the inflation. And the more the inflation is, the more you collect your GST and your sales taxes and this and
Hmm.
that on a number of
Hmm.
things. Not all items, not all basic foods you wouldn't, but on a lot of other things. And so one of the things in Saskatchewan, where I live, is the government said, well, we have a crown corporation collecting it, Sask Energy, and we're just not going to give you the carbon tax. We're not going to charge our customers, and they're not going to pay it. Well, all of a
Oh,
sudden,
really?
we've got very favorable, manageable inflation rates here, because
Hmm.
they cut this inflation out, because you pay
Interesting.
more in these carbon taxes than you do the actual portion of
All
consumption.
right.
Yeah.
So you're saying, Lee, that the decision then by the Scott Moe government to actually not collect that carbon tax anymore, and I think that started, was it of January 1? Is that correct?
Yep, they said starting this year we're not going to collect it, and they haven't. Now
Okay.
it'll be an interesting legal challenge because at the end of the month
Hmm.
that money is due, and if they haven't remitted it to the government, they're in defiance of the law and federalized. But the province says the legislation that we have made actually protects us from that. Um,
Okay. But clearly that's an example because this isn't just about Alberta. These are questions that impact every province, right? How federal policies are impacting the growth and prosperity of every province. So in Saskatchewan's case, you're saying that they actually made the decision not to collect that carbon tax as of January 1. So we'll see where that goes legally or how it's challenged. But the point is that that's moderated inflation. Um, and so that's actually coming out now within the lives of people who live in Saskatchewan. They're seeing prices more reasonable. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's coming out in Statistics Canada reports too, and this was just a few days ago where they specifically mentioned it. So yes, I mean, even if it's just on the home heating, it's not on anything else. But you have to
Hmm.
remember also the fuller context of this is in the Maritimes, they rely on heating oil. It's only 3% of Canadians that use heating oil, but you'll find 40% of them in Atlantic Canada. And
Hmm.
Atlantic Canada does not have that many people to warrant that. So they rely on it heavily, and the Liberals, put their finger to the wind and saw which way it was blowing and said, "Oh, well, we're going to give you a reprieve for 3 years. We're not going to charge the carbon tax on you," because it was coming
Hmm.
due. They'd allowed them to do their provincial plans, but as it was coming due, they couldn't. It was increasing, and so when it hit the next $15 per ton, they couldn't do it anymore. So
So,
that was not going to fly politically, and so they decided to exempt them. Now, if you look at the carbon emissions per British thermal unit, so this is the carbon emissions per amount of heat produced by fuel oil versus natural gas, it's 50% more emissions for fuel oil. So if there was something to exempt, you should be exempting natural gas, not fuel oil. But for purely political reasons, they did that. And that's why the Saskatchewan government said, look, we know what you're doing. And so we're not going to go by this. You should be giving us an exemption too. People have to heat their homes, period. There's no choice in that. And these
all
electric heat
right.
pumps that they want them to turn to are not so reliable in the coldest of temperatures either.
Yeah, it's a totally impractical policy. Um, so I do have a question from the audience, and that is, how is the growth of the public sector impacted employment?
Okay, I can show that in a few different ways, and let's see if I can actually get this onto the screen. Now, I'm not going to take too long doing this. If I can't, then then we won't do it. But
I guess the question really
let's see.
is the
Oh,
growth of government changed the opportunities? Because I think that's a point that you do reference in the report is that, and this is fascinating in Alberta, a key strength to its economy has been small business, the growth of self-employed entrepreneurs, and they're out there thriving, but that's been diminished. I think that's one of the key points that you make in the report, is it not?
yeah, the self-employed, it has diminished for them, and what you see is the public sector employment has gobbled up what the self-employed had. There's only, in this 12-year period, we only have about 7,100 more self-employed people in our country of 40 million. We only have that many more than we did 12 years ago. So the
Mhm.
population has grown a lot, but the self-employed has stayed static. What's really grown is the bureaucracy. And thankfully, Alberta, both municipally and provincially, has shown great restraint. It's had reasonable growth, not crazy growth in its bureaucracy. In the
Hmm.
NDP government was actually the least growth, which only makes sense because when you have a private sector that's suffering so badly, it's not the time to go on a public spending spree and hiring spree. But
Hmm.
the federal government has no shame. That's exactly what they're doing, and they're paying them much better. And so,
Okay.
yeah.
So you're saying that in the federal case, the public sector has grown tremendously, and I'm just trying to recall the numbers. You'd have to look at the specific time reference, but we're talking. This is represented, I believe, a significant part of the employment growth. And Lee, I reference or refer to you in terms of those stats. I don't believe we can share the screen in this format, Lee, but what I do know is that the growth of the public sector has a big impact on the growth of the private sector, which is really the key to driving forward economic prosperity and ultimately your quality of life. Is that part of the point that your report is making?
Well, you need to have, I mean, the if you're relying on the public sector more and more, the public sector cannot feed itself. You can't tax the public sector to employ the public sector unless you want to have a completely communist regime.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be the private sector that is growing, that creates the new products and services that increase the quality of life from which you can tax and then fund your programs and whatnot. Government is very
Hmm.
bulky. Government overpays. Government does things that are not responsive to market signals. And whatever the
Mm-hmm.
government does, it will do it less efficiently than the private sector, because that's just the way it will always be because of the nature of the beast. And so the more that
Mm-hmm.
we see government doing, oh, we did this, we did that, in the end, it's going to be bad for the economy, and it's going to be bad for people's standard of living and what they can do. And so what I found was in the Trudeau years, we saw the total wages and salaries go up in the public sector by 70.3% in these 12 years.
Sorry, can you
For
repeat
the
that number?
federal, 70% increase in the total pay to federal government employees. So
Wow.
this excludes the military, but the actual federal government administration. So we're not necessarily talking crowns and whatnot, but just the pure federal civil service. Provincially, in most of Canada, it went up 44% during that time, but in Alberta, it only went up 21% in those 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Same
Mm-hmm.
thing, very close numbers to that municipally as well in both counts. So
Mm-hmm.
it has, there's been pretty good restraint in Alberta. They've kept that really as it should be. But Ottawa has just taken a completely different tack. It happened under the first Trudeau, and it's happening again.
Okay, so I'm talking to our audience with research fellow Lee Harding about his report, 12 Years of Labor in Alberta. And so policy does matter. It has an impact on our lives. So when you think of the importance of this report, Lee, why does this matter to Canadians? Is there a quick answer to that?
Well, yes, the federal government is biting the hand that feeds it, and it's
Mm.
going to turn this whole country into a disabled torso, because
Oh my,
we
that's
are killing what
pretty
works.
dramatic language, is it not, Lee?
Sure, I'll give you some more if you want.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean,
But your
look, this
point
is
is that
what works. This
this is a very serious threat to people's prosperity. That's what your point is it not?
Yes, and the government knows what it's doing. I mean, I don't think that they're that stupid to not realize what's happening. But maybe they are. I mean, I'm at a loss because it really does not add up.
Hmm.
And the math of the climate science doesn't add up. The cost and benefit analysis of the worldwide climate change efforts.
Hmm.
Just before this recent conference of the parties 26 that they had in Dubai, there was a very in-depth analysis that was done that said, no, actually, it's going to be worse for the economy, because they're saying that if we do these punishing things, it's going to help, because otherwise we'll have storms that are so bad it's going to wipe us out, and that'll cause economic damage. But the best information says no, that's not the case.
Okay. So I do have a question from the audience, and that is what should governments do? What I guess what's the upshot here?
Well, I think this net zero plan needs to be abandoned. It's not based on good evidence. It really isn't. There's a big money train of people that are funding the science and then getting their big companies to get rebates from the government and projects from the government to do these things. It is another excuse for a wealth transfer from the common people to elites. That's really what it is. And it's as we lose our collective economic and political power, it's just going to be concentrated more in the hands of a few and create a new kind of serfdom. And that's what I think the people that are above our national governments in their influence, in their money, in their power, in their objectives, really know that that's what this is. And this is just a convenient Trojan horse, because no one, for no good reason, would say, oh, well, let's just stop driving our cars now. Let's stop heating our homes. Let's stop, it doesn't make sense. Let's not go anywhere. No. Let's not build any roads. How could you ever have a Canadian government suggest let's not build any roads? It's one thing to say that constitutionally, which is true, that this transportation stuff is a provincial responsibility. So as a federal government, we shouldn't be funding it. That argument I can accept. But to say, oh, it's a good policy to not build any more roads, that is so dumb.
All right. So I know we're speaking a little bit beyond the quote scope of the report here, because the report is really based on a lot of statistical evidence to clearly demonstrate that governance matters, who's in power matters, and their policies matter on every one of us. But I think it's interesting that you're asking a larger question and making a larger statement that these policies could be very well intentional to almost strike a war against the middle class. Like if you look at affordability issues, that's a major concern. By the way, I noticed that it just came out this week, the information from Blacklock's reporter, the media service, that the federal government spent, what is it, some $1.6 million on 3 retreats to discuss actions to improve affordability for Canadians, ironically. But in this context, I think a lot of Canadians are wondering, wow, life has become increasingly less affordable for a lot of people. They're very, they're struggling. I think another survey showed that some 60% of Canadians are really on the line financially. So you'd say that a lot of this is intentional. Now, that's certainly one viewpoint, Lee. Is another viewpoint that some of these parties actually believe in the efficacies of their policies and don't realize that they're really not linked or grounded in reality of the situation, or is it both?
Well, that's what our, Premier Smith said in her speech yesterday. She said it would be great to have a quote strategic partner, end quote, instead of a quote delusional adversary, end quote.
Yes,
That's what she called
right.
Ottawa. So it is
Yeah.
delusional. I am sure there are many people in university right now just learning politics because they knew nothing before, and now they're getting filled with the ideas that this is an absolute necessity, because what economy can you have when we're all dead? But that's just not
Okay.
what
Well,
we're headed for.
Well, I think maybe part of this is grounded up by really a perverse economic theory. We call it modern monetary theory. I think it was one of these bad ideas that came out of France, an economist, as I recall. But basically, that theory that kind of suggested that economic deficits don't matter. In essence, that somehow the government can go on spending deficits ad infinitum. It's really quite disturbing. And so within that context, like if you look at the amount of deficits and debt accumulated now by the federal government, it's more than every previous government combined in Canadian history. So the numbers really are stunning. So if you come at it from that kind of assumption that money doesn't affect grow on trees, and I know I'm being pretty crass about it, then I suppose you would kind of consider all these policies possible. You can put the oil and gas sector out of business, and you can just still chug along in terms of your economic future. Am I misreading that, Lee?
Well, let me address what you're saying in this way. I think that at some level, as I said, that this is a grab for wealth and power. And many of the
Mm.
agendas that we see going forth, whether they take, what was it, Karl Marx, or was it Stalin that called these people useful idiots? The people
I
that
believe it
believe the
was Stalin.
Marxist, yes, the people that believe the Marxist lie, some of them believe it. There's a few people that want to remake the world in the image they think, which of course puts
Mhm,
them on top because they feel quite entitled to run this planet. They
mhm,
want it to go the way that they want. And so through various mechanisms and whatever World Economic Forum and this and that, they're influencing towards these ideas. And once you have enough funding of the research grants and this and that, and you get to say, oh, these climate deniers, we can't even give them 5 seconds of airtime because someone might believe them, and then we won't do what we have to save the earth, and then the earth will be gone. This
mhm.
whole stupidity snowballs into a size that is, it does overtake us. um, yeah, we need to have an economy that works, and we had one that was working fine before we had all of this distraction for these kinds of issues. And the other thing is, contrary to what Charlie Angus says, we do have energy production that, and mining production for that matter, that is very, as far as carbon emissions go and other
Mm,
environmental aspects, very minimal, remarkably minimal.
mhm.
And what we should be
Yeah.
doing is making sure we have more of it before the other guys who don't do these environmental practices grab those
Mhm,
markets. We could be the winner and win for the environment such as they see it, if they were consistent with their argumentation. But now we have people like Charlie Angus saying, "Oh, you shouldn't be allowed to say that." He called his bill a historic moment, just like when tobacco companies were not allowed to say that tobacco didn't harm us. This is the same
mhm.
thing with oil. You cannot make these arguments like I'm making now. So I would be
Yeah.
whatever, fined or jailed. Um, there are times that get so stupid and evil that you might as well just show that you don't belong and keep speaking. That's what I have to say.
Well, it certainly you're giving us reality therapy, Lee, in terms of not just the stats here from your report, but also what is the larger agenda going on. So, audience, we'd love to hear your questions and comments about. If you have comments about the report, we'd love to hear it. This is an important report because it does underline that policy does matter. Who's in charge does matter. So, if we look at this. At the report again, I guess one of the things that I found interesting is the whole question regarding certain eras. Those in power in Alberta do, have made a difference. So, is there a shining star when you look at who has been in power? Is there an example where you can say, well, we need more of that type of government versus another?
Well, I think that what we see is how not to do it, especially. The only
Mhm,
thing that was good in the Notley government was that there wasn't a big growth in the pay and amounts in the actual provincial government.
oh,
We have seen, and another thing that happened consistently through all of the governments was we had growth in the sector of agriculture and forestry and the like.
mhm,
And so that, and mining. And so that is another thing which, as this net zero stuff reaches beyond the low hanging fruit of oil and gas, it is now trying to reach into agriculture to say, you can't have too much nitrogen. Well, that
mhm,
nitrogen is going to make the crops grow. So again, it's I don't want to call it a starvation plan, but you can easily see how when you do this sort of thing, it is not good. And I mean, when we see in
mhm,
Europe the extreme examples of culling herds and this and that, I
mhm.
mean, it's no wonder that the farmers they have nothing to lose. That's why the
No,
farmers
wait a
are in the
sec here.
street.
If in terms of the audience, can you just clarify when you refer to Europe, what do you mean? Like what's going on there?
Well, as I said, we have groups that, like in some countries, and I think it was Ireland. I'm scared to get into details because
Yeah.
the headlines kind
No,
of
but
blur.
I'm
But there
referring
have
to your
been
comment,
countries
Lee,
where
about
what we have is
culling
people who
herds.
are they are culling herds of cattle in places, saying that you just can't grow them because the methane that they breathe out is going to have too much methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas, more potent than
Wow.
carbon, and so we cannot
Yeah.
have that. And then there are other things with fertilizers where they're wanting to limit the use. In Sri Lanka, there was pretty much a coup because the people said we need to have conventional farming methods. We cannot do this without chemical fertilizers. So there, it's only been a really populist uprising that has prevented this from going on the way that it really could, because they would just steamroll all this stuff right over us, damn all the practicalities.
Right. So, I think what you're referring to are really important examples where, like in Sri Lanka, they were imposing a radical change in farming practices, including the taking away of fertilizers. And there was an uprising. There was an overthrow of the government because people were so angry because there were food shortages and the impacts on people's lives. So, do you think in the case of Canada, I know they're introducing a lot of changes in agriculture as well. It's all part of this whole net zero program, the so-called just transition. That major bill was just passed in December. There's a large public debate about that, or dare I say, the intention was to actually limit debate on that bill. But it was passed by the NDP Liberal government federally. Will that have a big impact on Canadian agriculture then, from your perspective? Like, isn't it the same theme of these policies impacting our economy?
Well, yeah, it is all the same thing, and it leads us to the same destructive ends. And
Hmm.
and so with agriculture, they'd send out some things saying we're not saying you reduce the actual fertilizer amounts, you just reduce the emissions from fertilizer.
Hmm.
Well, the emissions, the farming practices have changed a lot in the last 40 years, and it has minimized emissions quite a bit already. So the only way you can really trim that fat is to lower the amount of fertilizers themselves. And I'm not sure, some of the bureaucrats in Ottawa in agriculture know that quite well, and maybe some of them don't. But
Exactly.
you can't do this on a massive scale. You cannot reduce emissions without reducing fertilizers. What it comes down to,
Hmm.
whether they insist that they can or not. So now we know from all of the UN reports and everyone who's pushing this stuff that that is something they want to do, that they're trying to have
Hmm.
happen through this. And so you can
Yeah.
imagine if you're, well, boy, there's no better way to control the people than to control the food. This is what
Yeah.
authoritarian governments do. So
No, I
you put
think
it
you're
all
right.
together. You have you can't put the gas in the car. You can't have a car that burns gas. You can't have a road. We won't build it. You can't have food. You can't grow it. I mean, what do they think we're dumb? This is bad.
Yeah.
Are they dumb,
No,
or are
it's
they
a dead
crazy like
end
a fox?
series of dead end policies. So, Lee, I can hear the voice of my friend Dr. Dennis Modry, the one of the founders of the Alberta Prosperity Institute, who would be saying, you know what, this just is further proof that our federal system is not working, that the federal government keeps intruding into provincial jurisdiction. They're outside their constitutional lane, and they're aggressively pursuing a series of policies which are destructive for people's lives and the economy and our future. So, is this the context? Is that the other context as well, where Alberta, among other provinces, I'm thinking of Saskatchewan as an example, because they really have the same issues among others, would not like why wouldn't any province seriously consider saying, if this isn't working, we need to pull a Quebec. We need to start pushing our powers forward. We need to assert our provincial jurisdiction for the benefit of the people, not some Ottawa elite. Is that what's going on here as well?
Well, yeah. I mean, I know some Easterners that are conservatives that actually welcome these Western upstart movements because they think it's actually going to be good for Canada if the West can assert itself more.
Indeed. Yeah.
And also with Quebec, I mean, on our Supreme Court, under our Constitution, three of those nine have to be from Quebec.
Yes.
So
Hmm.
you can pull a Quebec if you have only 1/4 of the people, but 1/3 of the judges. But if you're the West, or the Quebec, maybe now I don't want to assume that a Quebec judge would side against the West just because they're from Quebec. It's not like that.
Hmm.
But let's say that it
Hmm.
was. You need a majority of 5. Well, there's only 6 of them that aren't from Quebec. So,
Hmm.
if you need to get a 5 out of 6, unless at least one of the Quebecers is on your side. So,
Hmm.
it's in some ways our Constitution is very good in its division of powers, but starting with Pierre Trudeau, there was a big vision to centralize things. And actually, I think in some ways it predates it back to the World War I era. But our
Hmm.
first 50 years were very low. It was no income taxes.
Hmm.
We had strong families, and we had faith, and we had society, we had values, and those were enough for us to grow in our prosperity and settle the West. I mean, boy, you're building a sod house. There's no, they're almost taking us back to that though, where you will be left with a sod house and no
Hmm.
electricity, and
Yeah.
maybe have your horses plowing the land.
Well, let's hope not. Um, but it is interesting that these kinds of policies really do create a lot of friction, a lot of conflict within our federal system, and beg the question: well, is our federal system working? And certainly within good public policy, we'd say a very important principle. Many of them are at stake. One of which is that you want to empower people. You want to create policy that empowers individuals to make their decisions well and move power and authority as close to the people as possible, whether that's through local government or the provincial government. And I think that's been a real strength of our federal system. And this is in contrast with the way the United States has evolved, where too much power and authority, way too much, many would argue, is at the federal level. So it's almost like your observation is very important, Lee, that a lot of power or a lot of efforts have been to centralize power in Canada. But we would say, well, that's really the wrong direction. You want to empower the people and have as much power towards them, whether it's through the provincial level or the local government level. So I think that's an important observation.
One of the things that the Americans have is they can bring forward a lot more citizen-initiated referenda questions.
Hmm.
And in many ways, although that kind of governmental system purportedly doesn't allow it, I find in many ways that the states have quite a bit of power. They don't tax nearly as much as their federal government, and that's probably good for the states and bad for the feds. But
Hmm.
they do have citizens do have some more controls than we would have here in Canada.
Yeah.
We think about healthcare, where through the Canada Health Act, the federal government has put its fingers through funding and then, but with strings attached, actually with shackles,
Hmm.
and that's prevented any kind of healthcare delivery that looks like the ones we have in Europe. And all we do is pride ourselves in it not being American. Meanwhile, we can buy healthcare for a dog or cat. We can't buy it for ourselves. We'll wait on a waiting list
Hmm.
until the way we get off the waiting list is we're dead, or we took a trip to Mexico to get that. It's
Hmm.
and now they're just going into dentistry. They've destroyed. I mean, I'm hearing terrible things about childcare, where it's really they just give a bunch of paperwork for the ones that they're making do this government sponsored $10 a day daycare, and some other one. It's leading to some closing because they can't compete, and it's actually lowering spaces. I mean, everything that this federal government has touched, it's the non-Midas touch. Instead of turning it to gold, it turns to stone, and
Wow.
it's really disturbing. And I mean, I would not be saying it. It wouldn't matter what the color of government it was, as terms of party colors. if it weren't true. But it's just really, really
Hmm.
bad. And it's been
Yeah.
consistently bad through the last 8.5 years.
Well, so as we look to citizens and um, even decision makers, what advice do you have in terms of actions that citizens or even decision makers could make, given the reality that we have a lot of policies that are negatively impacting not just Alberta, but other provinces as well? Like, what do you have any advice in terms of that set of actions, Lee?
Well, I wish we could retable every pipeline application and resource project application that got turned down and rubber stamp it and have it run like today.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but that would not be possible. I remember I knew someone who worked on the Trans Canada East application, and it was 30,000 pages. And the mayor of Montreal says, "Well, I don't think these guys have done their homework." Like they have no.
Hmm.
This is completely clueless comment. Um, we do have a lot of environmental rigor. We had it before. I think we need an
Hmm.
omnibus. We need a change of government, and we need an omnibus act, the omnibus reverse Trudeau act, where we would reverse everything that he did. And if there was any
Hmm.
part of it that we discover later might have been okay, we can reintroduce it. But let's get rid of it all. Trudeau wiped out most of what Harper did in 1 year. And I think there needs to be a change of government where the same is done. And we need to have provinces that extract the resources while we have them and get them to the world before the world has been diluted into not using them anymore. Because if there is going to be a net zero, one stage at 2030 and a fuller stage by 2050, this resource-based economy in this country is running out of time. We need to get it out there. And if they're going to bulldoze us and bludgeon us and do whatever it takes to get to net zero by then, well, that's then. But for
Okay.
now, let's get it out there.
So a key thing would be for both decision makers and citizens to join hands to try to work resource projects forward. On that note, I think of, well, it's interesting. I believe in the next quarter, the Trans Mountain pipeline will be completed or come on stream. I could be wrong on that exact time frame. I think they had some um, minor challenges that they had to get through. So we'll wait and see. Hopefully, that will come on stream this next year for sure. But I believe that will make an impact in terms of exporting more oil to the market. And there's many other ones as well. But the point is that citizens, though, also have a voice. So they have the ability to change course in terms of policy, a new government. Um, but they citizens should be speaking up, shouldn't they, Lee?
Well, they should. The thing that disturbs me the most is I think we have a government now that if urban Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver likes what they're doing, and enough of Atlantic Canada and a smattering of major other Canadian cities with a lot of government employees and university educated people, if they like it, doesn't matter if the rest of us don't like it or do like it. So I just hope that the people that vote for these governments by default that are making these bad decisions, that they'd not do so, or even have the courage to see that there's better alternatives. And that is important. But I think also there needs to be more discussions on the civic level. And I don't know what to say. I mean, a lot of us that see the world differently from what this mainstream message seems to be have a hard time changing that culture. I think a lot of that intervention probably needs to happen with student groups at universities and hiring departments there. I think that
Hmm.
our academia is fueling a lot of this, and once a person gets indoctrinated, it takes something very, very earth shattering for them to change their mind. Unfortunately, there's very
Hmm.
few open-minded
Wow.
people. Their opinions are pretty entrenched. And much as I think people need to speak up and rise up and have more power than they think, I also think that there's some people that will not be convinced for any amount of facts. And and we have a corruption to the core that has reached into our institutions globally and nationally. It's a good time to pray.
Well, it's a tough reality that you're challenging us with, Lee. It is interesting. I did notice this week the release of an interesting public opinion survey and report. I think it was from one of our sister think tanks called the McDonald-Laurier Report Institute, pardon me, and they reported that in terms of public surveys, that by far the majority of Canadians do not kind of buy the woke narrative. Now, it depends on any specific policy topic, but it's interesting that it seems like the evidence, and I think anecdotally we notice this as well in our own daily lives, that most Canadians don't really buy a lot of this kind of woke narrative. What I mean by that is kind of a cultural Marxist perspective on gender fluidity to all kinds of topics, or kind of an extremism when it comes to environmental policy. So perhaps that gives us hope that if we can speak up, that will also give solace or some measure of accountability to those decision makers that are in office, that they can move forward with confidence, realizing the majority are with them and not with this small number. But I think it is a significant challenge. But perhaps that's a perspective that gives us a little bit of hope.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think that, but those private voices need to have some kind of public presence. That's why when you see things like don't
Mhm.
delete parents.ca, and you have these petitions to say we support parents being told before that you start
Mhm.
calling my male kid a she and whatever else, that you need to have that public face, and there also needs to be a certain core of academics that allow it. And that's why I think this diversity, the DEI stuff, equity, inclusion, that is becoming a paradigm through which universities must interpret and act and do everything
Mhm.
is extremely dangerous, is because it's an ideological takeover, and it's really going to smother a look at merit, and it actually
Mhm.
reinforces people defining people on the basis of race as much as any overt racism
Mhm.
would.
Indeed. Well, and Lee, it's interesting on that point. I mean, I think we're going beyond, in some measure, the report itself, but all these things are interrelated. So if we had to think of practical action, then um, perhaps one of the recommendations to premiers of all provinces, it's not just Alberta, Saskatchewan, and others, that we give a hard look at our universities and ask ourselves, why are we using taxpayers' money to fund hotbeds of indoctrination that are ultimately opposed to the development of our own province? When we think of oil and gas, I mean, I do remember well years ago, I think it was the University of Alberta giving an honorary doctorate to David Suzuki. And I think, well, no offense to Dr. David Suzuki, but I can think of um, frankly, many more candidates that would have been deserving. And meanwhile, the irony is that the University of Alberta has been generously funded by a province founded in oil and gas, which Dr. Suzuki is intimately involved in shutting down. I mean, this is the paradox, is it not?
Well, you're speaking to a larger problem. That is that what we have in society right now is a retrovirus. We have something more like an autoimmune disease, and so our immune system is supposed to keep foreign things out of us, so you keep the body healthy. But now we have an immune system. Our institutions are busy at work attacking its own self. That's why I say we're eating our own flesh, and we're attacking our organs, and it's going to cause systemic failure and the death of Canada as we know it if it continues. Because we are feeding the institutions that will destroy us. When we take John A. Macdonald's statue, when city halls vote to take John A. Macdonald's statue down, just like they did in Regina, they're cutting down the Democratic Foundation. They're in a tree house and they're chopping down the tree. And I don't think they get that, because when you don't have Canada, what do you have? Um, the
Mhm.
UN.
Right. Well said, Lee, and certainly Sir John A. Macdonald, our great founding prime minister, has an incredible historical record of forming a nation. I would suggest that without Sir John A., we would not have had the country of Canada. And he saved tens of thousands of Aboriginal Canadians as they brought food to save people from a very difficult point of starvation on the plains. It was really a remarkable story. So I agree with you that we need to know our history, and those are very worrisome signs when people take down those kinds of symbolic statues in remembrance of our history, and they don't know our history. So I think well said, Lee. But I did want to thank you for joining our conversation today, Lee, and for your research as you've tabled this report. And I encourage people to look at it to make sure they see it on the website at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. But thank you very much for your voice as you document the impact of these policies and for your courage and your leadership, Lee.
Oh, thanks, David. You got a great thing going on with the show, and I thank you for letting me be a part of it today.
Thank you, Lee. And so that brings to a conclusion our live chat today was pretty far reaching. We thank you for your questions and your comments, and we welcome them. Be sure to like the program and share it with others. If you think it's important, if you think that the kind of prosperity and quality of life is important for our Canadian society and along with democratic values and freedom, we encourage you to share it with others. And we welcome you to join our conversation. So on that note, I want to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our next conversation next week, every Thursday at the same time. And we'll look forward to it. And in the meantime, I wish you a great week.